Now, I just want to do a couple of really quick things to lay a little bit of foundation, because you would not believe the congregations that I go into to talk about Israel, and people scratch their heads and say, what? What? Why should we care about that? Or I begin to share things from the prophets or from Genesis, and people say, oh, well, we're a New Testament church. That's not important to us. Well, it is important. So let me just very quickly lay a little bit of foundation, a little bit of biblical foundation. Israel is on everybody's minds because God said millennia ago to a man named Abraham, I am going to enter into eternal, unconditional covenant with you and with all your descendants after you. And that covenant involves that little strip of real estate along the Mediterranean Sea that today we call the nation of Israel. An eternal, everlasting covenant. And then God, all throughout what we might call the Old Testament, reiterated that covenant over and over and over again. And we can go all the way to the prophets. We sang about the prophets this morning. We said these are the days of Ezekiel. Well, I would agree. Absolutely. You need to read Ezekiel if you haven't read Ezekiel lately. Read what Ezekiel says, what God said through that prophet. God said, I am going to bring the Jewish people into the nation of Israel. I'm going to fight their battles. I'm going to establish them there. And we know that he did that. And then he said, but when you get there, you're going to forget about me. You're going to go after other gods. You're going to spill the blood of your own children on the land. And because of that, you're not going to be able to stay there. I am going to have to disperse you. And we know that he did that. Those prophecies were clearly fulfilled. And then he says, as long as you're out of the land, people, my name is being disgraced. My name is being profaned. Now, that doesn't mean, as I've heard some pastors say, that it's because the Jewish people are so awful, they just disgrace the name of God everywhere they go. That's not what the prophet is saying. The prophet is saying, as long as the Jewish people are not in the land, that eternal, unconditional covenant that God made with Abraham is not being fulfilled. And so it makes him look like a God who is either ineffectual or just doesn't care. So his name is being disgraced. And God says, because of that, it can't always be that way. I'm going to bring you back from the four corners of the earth. I'm going to bring you back into the land. He does remind them, however, it's not because you deserve it, he says. It's not because you're so powerful. He says, it's because of me. It's for my name's sake, God says. It's for the restoration of my sovereignty before the nations. It's all about my reputation. That's what God says. God says to the Jewish people through the prophet, I am going to use my covenant faithful relationship with you to reveal myself to the nations. So that's what we're seeing today. That's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. And then he says, once you get there, amazing things are going to happen. You're going to make the desert bloom. Well, most on this side have seen the desert blooming. You guys over here, you need to go and see the desert blooming, because the desert is blooming. It's absolutely remarkable. And he says, you're going to rebuild the ancient cities. And part of what Bridges for Peace does is we have relationships with communities from Dan to Beersheba, where we are able to help support the poverty-stricken in those communities. Many of those communities have names that you would recognize in reading your Bibles. And those communities have been desolate for the past 2,000 years as the Jewish people have been out of the land. But now God is bringing the Jewish people back. And as the desert blooms, those ancient cities are being rebuilt, and they are beautiful, amazing, prosperous communities. God is on the move, fulfilling Bible prophecy in a way he never has before. Incredible. It's absolutely incredible. Now, I like to think that all of those millennia ago, when prophets like Ezekiel looked into the future. And they talked about the restoration of the nation. They talked about the Jewish people coming back from the four corners of their... They also talked about the relationship between the Jewish people and the Gentiles. That it would be the Gentiles that would help. Gentiles would come alongside, and they would sort of be the hands and feet of the Lord as the Jewish people were brought back into the land. We're seeing it today. I believe when those prophets looked to the future, it was us that they saw. I believe it. It was us that they saw. And I want to challenge, I've got a number of challenges for you today, but one thing that I really want to challenge you with, I want you to stop for just a moment and realize, please, you could have been born anytime. You could have. I mean, God is an amazing God, right? But you weren't. You were born for this moment. You were handcrafted for this moment. You're not some kind of genetic accident. God created you. He fashioned you. He formed you for good works for this day. That's awesome. That's kind of a hallelujah moment, isn't it? Yeah. Awesome. It's awesome. And he placed you where you are. And that is also awesome, because I go into lots of churches where pastors don't have a heart for Israel. I go into a lot of churches where they have no understanding of the importance of what's happening in that country today, where they don't realize that the destiny of the church is inextricably linked to the destiny of the nation of Israel. But God put you here, and you know that. God is revealing things to you that he hasn't yet revealed to a lot of Christians. So here you are, fashioned, hand-built, created for this moment, and God is revealing to you his heart. What an awesome, awesome thing. But with it comes awesome responsibility. If we had a rabbi here with us today, he would say, with every blessing comes attendant responsibility. There's no such thing as a blessing without responsibility that comes with it. And we are incredibly blessed. You are incredibly blessed. And with that comes responsibility. So I want to challenge you to just take a moment from time to time and think about the fact that God created you for this moment. God is blessing you in incredible ways. And ask him, what then, Father, is my responsibility? Mine. My responsibility in my home, my responsibility in my community, my responsibility in my church, but also my responsibility for the nation of Israel and the Jewish people in this day. What, Father, is my responsibility? Now, amazing things are happening in the nation of Israel, and the desert is blooming, and the ancient cities are rebuilt, and the Jewish people are coming home from the four corners of the earth because God is moving. But you know, it was only 67 years ago that it didn't really look that way. Little Israel, brand new, fledgling nation with only 600,000 to 800,000 people, and not a whole lot more than just a bunch of chutzpah, a lot of courage. And a dream, a vision for the future. And here we are only 67 years later. And that nation is thriving. It's a thriving democracy. It has the most well-established free market economy on earth. I just read that the other day. 8.25 million people, over 7 million of them Jewish people. Incredible. Incredible, because God is fulfilling prophecy. If you have friends that say, I don't think I believe in God, why should I believe in God? Well, tell them the story of Israel. Tell them the story of God's faithfulness. Tell them the story of promises that were made 3,000 years ago that are being fulfilled before our very eyes. Incredible, incredible. And God is positioning Israel as he is keeping those promises to be a light to the nations. And we're seeing it. We're seeing Israel be a light to the nations. Israel is often the first on the scene when there is any kind of disaster anywhere in the world, anywhere, whether it's in Turkey or Haiti or Japan or Nepal. Israel is there immediately with state-of-the-art medical equipment and personnel to be a light, to be a light. And of course, we know Israel's at the forefront of innovation in virtually every area, whether it's medicine or communication or technology or whatever it might be. Israel is at the forefront, a light, exporting all of that wisdom and innovation to nations all around the world, blessing the nations, blessing the nations. And as God is doing these incredible things in Israel, he's doing something else. He is in the process of restoring the relationship between his two covenant peoples, restoring the relationship between Jews and Christians. And we know, I'm sure you've studied the history in this room. You know how the Jewish people have suffered throughout the ages, often at the hands of those that called themselves Christians. You know that there has been a chasm deep and wide between our two communities, a chasm so wide that many thought we would never be able to cross. We would never mend that fence. The pain so deep that we would never be able to get past it. Well, we are living in a day when God is on the move and healing is happening. And it is a privilege for us, for each one of you, to be alive today and be an instrument in that healing. Because that's what God is calling the church to do, to be an instrument in that process of healing. I can tell you that it was only a few years ago, if I was in a conversation with an Israeli and that Israeli found out that I was a Christian, which often they did because we're very, very open about our Christianity at Bridges for Peace. We want the Jewish people to know who we are and in whose name we come. But often that would make the conversation very uncomfortable. A wall would go up. Sometimes the conversation would end. But I can tell you today it's not like that. Today, when I'm talking to that Israeli and he finds out that I'm a Christian, he wants to shake my hand. He wants to touch my shoulder, sometimes with tears. He will say, I don't know how to thank you, because we are coming to realize that Christians around the world are the very best friends that we have. Some of them will even say, Christians are the only friends that we have. Remarkable. God is healing. He's healing. And again, it's such a privilege to be alive, to be a part of it. Now, there's other areas where God is moving, and I want to talk with you a little bit about that right now, and that is in the church, in the body of Yeshua worldwide. God is doing something that he has never done before in the history of the church. Now, that's pretty awesome too, isn't it? And what he's doing is he is taking Christianity and he is reattaching it to its Hebraic root. He's plugging us back into our Jewish foundations. And we are the first generation in the history of the church where God has done that. A move of his Spirit globally. Millions of Christians worldwide are coming to understand, coming to become intrigued with this idea of being restored to our Hebraic roots, coming to view the Bible with a new set of lenses, a Hebraic set of lenses, a set of lenses that deepens our understanding, encourages us to expand our thinking and see God in a deeper and more profound way, opening our eyes to make us better disciples, allowing us to read the Bible in the appropriate historical context, the cultural context that generations before us were not able to do. That's another blessing, another remarkable blessing. And so I want to talk to you just a little bit today about discipleship. And I was so thrilled as you talked about discipleship and being involved with YWAM, and because discipleship it's such a critical part, again, of the call of God on the church today. And often when I'm traveling around and I'm invited to speak in a church or for a group, they say, what would you like to talk about? Oh, I'd like to talk about discipleship. Oh, you don't need to do that. We already did that. Been there, done that, got the T-shirt, we did the online course, whatever. But often, if I push a little bit, oh, wonderful, that's excellent. How did it change your life? I sort of get a blank stare. How did it change your thinking? How did it affect your heart? How did it change you? A blank stare. And I believe part of the reason for that is that many churches are building on the wrong foundation. We need to have a Hebraic understanding of discipleship. People talk about a biblical worldview often. Well, I believe you cannot have a true biblical worldview unless it's Hebraic. A Hebraic worldview is a biblical worldview. A Hebraic understanding of discipleship creates real disciples. And that's one of the things that God has really put on my heart to share with the church around the world. Now, a lot of Christians think this whole idea of discipleship, that's a Christian thing. That started with John the Baptist, right? At the beginning of the book. Remember? When he's baptizing all those people? Yeah. Well, that's not true. Actually, the concept of discipleship is intricately woven into Judaism and has been for millennia. And I want to share a little story with you that will help to illustrate that. This is a story of a rabbi. Now, this rabbi lived in a very, very poor community, a wonderful, dedicated rabbi. And he had just one constant prayer. He constantly called out to God, and he asked for a second pair of trousers. Now, that may seem a little odd, but he wanted those trousers to be sanctified to the Shabbat because he only had one other pair. He wanted a pair of trousers that he could sanctify to the Shabbat, only wear them on that holiest day of the week. And one day, as he was walking down the street in the village, he encountered the wife of Eliyahu the giant, tall man in the village. And she said, "Oh, Rabbi, I'm so excited to see you. We were gifted with some things from some relatives, and in there was a pair of trousers we'd like to give to you." Well, the rabbi was ecstatic. Finally, God had answered his prayer. So he ran home with those trousers, and he told his wife his good fortune. And he said, "Oh, my dear, if you would just shorten them for me, because they belong to Eliyahu, I could wear them tomorrow. Tomorrow is Shabbat." And his wife said, "Oi, are you kidding? I have to kill the chicken, clean the chicken, cook the chicken, bake the bread. No time. I'm sorry. I just can't do it." So he went to his daughter, shared the good fortune, and asked her the same question. She said, "Oh, Papa, I'm sorry. I have to help Mama. She's got to kill the chicken, clean the chicken, cook it. And if I'm not doing that, I have to study. I just don't have time." Well, the rabbi was very, very disappointed. And that night when he went to bed, he spread the trousers out on the bed next to him. On the floor next to his bed. And he went to sleep dreaming about how God had answered his prayer. In the middle of the night, his wife woke up. And she said, "How could I have been so? My husband is so wonderful. I'm going to surprise him." So she snuck around to the other side of the bed, didn't light the lamp because she didn't want to wake him. She got the sewing basket and she kind of eyed those trousers and she chopped some off and stitched them up and went back to bed thinking how happy her husband would be in the morning. A little later, his daughter woke up. "How could I have been so thoughtless? Papa is, I'm going to surprise him." So she didn't light the lamp, didn't want to wake him up, snuck in there, whacked off some more and stitched them up and went back to bed thinking how happy Papa would be in the morning. Well, in the morning when Papa woke up, those trousers were the first thing on his mind. And he said, "You know what? I don't care if they are too long. I'm going to wear them anyway." So he jumped out of bed and he pulled them on only to discover they were no longer trousers, they were now shorts. But he threw his hands to heaven and he said, thank God they were so long to begin with, or I would have been found standing naked before the creator of the universe. It's an adorable story, but you know what the rabbis say? That's a story about discipleship. It's about discipleship because as long as you open yourself up to hear the voice of God, the way that voice is speaking today, as long as you allow God and those that he has put in leadership over you to inculcate into you, the more you absorb what it really means to be a disciple, the longer your trousers get. So someday when you go out into the world and the world starts chopping away at your trousers, which the world always does, they would have been long enough to begin with that you will never be found standing naked before the creator of the universe. It's a cute story, but it really exemplifies how important that concept of discipleship is in Jewish tradition. Like so much of what we hold dear in our faith, it came to us from that Judaic heritage. Now, unfortunately, a lot of Christians, when they think about discipleship, they have a very rational Greco-Roman way of thinking. And to them, discipleship is about belief, and belief is all about an intellectual activity. As a matter of fact, the word for discipleship in Greek comes from a root that means to think through to a final conclusion. So the concept of discipleship for a lot of Christians is all about what you believe. It's all about what you think. It's all about a decision that you made once for a lot of Christians. However, if we think Hebraically, that word for discipleship means to become second nature, to become accustomed to, so accustomed to that the performance of becomes second nature. It's not about what you think. It's about what you do. It's all about what you do. Not just a decision to believe, but a decision that is impetus for righteous action. That's what it's all about. That same Jewish friend that I mentioned before that likes to look for the Messiah, when I was first getting to know her, and she is a dear, dear friend, we've had amazing conversations. She said to me, I was trying to explain something to her that Christians believe, and she said to me, no. Don't tell me what you believe. Let me follow you around for 2 weeks, and then I'll tell you what you believe. That was a little startling. But she said, it really has very little to do with what you say. It has everything to do with what you do. That's what discipleship is all about. It's about learning to live our life, live our faith. The word in Hebrew, emunah, which is translated faith, actually means faithfulness. It's an action word. An action word. And did you know that at the time of Jesus, discipleship was such an integral part of that first century Judaism that it was actually institutionalized? Did you know that? It was a system. It was what we would call today a program, in a sense. You couldn't just decide you were going to be somebody's disciple. You had to be invited. And we see that in the scriptures, don't we? Jesus going from one to the, inviting them. And once you were invited, you had the opportunity to say yes or say no. But if you said yes, there were some pretty strict parameters that governed what your life was going to look like. You were committing for at least 3 years, and you were committing for 24/7. 24/7. Now, there were a lot of itinerant rabbis like Jesus in that first century Israel. And what you were committing to was walking with, traveling with, being with, sleeping with that master, if you will, 24/7, listening, watching, learning, absorbing, constantly. Now, you had some responsibilities because, of course, all of that learning and being with that master, that's a blessing. And with that blessing comes some responsibilities. One of those responsibilities was to make sure that your rabbi had enough to eat. That was your responsibility. Well, I think that sheds a little bit of light on some of the times where the disciples in our scriptures are absolutely panic-stricken. Oh no, what are we going to eat? It's not because they were concerned about their own stomachs. It was their responsibility. It was also their responsibility to make sure that their rabbi got enough rest. We also see that in the scriptures, making sure that the crowds stayed back so that Yeshua got enough rest. But another interesting responsibility of the disciple, was to challenge the rabbi in a respectful way, but challenge, ask, dig, until whatever the principle is became so clear that you were able to embrace it as your own. Challenging, digging, being strengthened. Now, among those disciples, there was the one in each group that floated to the top, the one that we might call the premier disciple, the best of the best of the best. And all disciples strove for that. Every one of them wanted to be the one. And that disciple was easily recognizable because the hallmark of that disciple was that he looked exactly like his master. Exactly. He didn't just think like him. He didn't just speak like him. He didn't just believe like him. He moved like him. His gestures were the same. His actions, his reactions, everything about him showed the world who his master was. And at the center of that belief was action. Everything that he did, every motion, every movement, everywhere he went, every action was to reveal to those around who the master actually was. Well, I believe that's what God is looking for today. That's the kind of disciples that God is calling the church to be for a few reasons. One of those reasons that Yeshua had those 12 disciples with him for 3 years, and he was training them, he was teaching them, he was perfecting them, because their world was changing very, very fast, very fast. They would see Yeshua arrested. They would see him crucified. They would see him buried. They would see him raised from the dead. They would see Israel thrown into complete chaos. They would be exiled from the land together with many Jewish people in the situation with the Romans. Their world was about to be turned upside down. And Yeshua knew it. And they needed to be ready. It would fall to them to take the message of God's love, of God's salvation to the entire globe. They needed to be ready. They would suffer persecution. They needed to be ready. Well, I suggest to you that our world is changing very fast. Very, very fast. We are seeing events today that the prophets could only dream of. And it's going to continue. It's going to continue. Our world is being turned upside down, and we need to be ready. We need to be those same kind of disciples that Jesus had in the first century. We need to look exactly like our master. We need to understand that our faith, our discipleship is more than a decision. It's an impetus for righteous action. We need to think and walk and talk and move and treat others around us just as Yeshua would, so that as people look at us, it's our master that they see. Now, there are some pretty incredible things happening in the world and in Israel. And I just want to share a few of those with you. How many of you pray regularly for Israel? Okay. Thank you. Thank you, those that pray regularly for Israel. Those of you that don't pray regularly, you should pray regularly for Israel. All of us, every believer, everyone who believes the Bible, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord should pray regularly for. We are told, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. It's not a suggestion. He doesn't say if you think of it or if you have time or, we're told to pray for the peace of Jerusalem. He says, if those that call on the name of the Lord, I have made you watchmen on the wall. That means all of us in this room have a mandate to pray for Israel. Critically important. And so I want to share, now that we are all on the same page, we are all prayer warriors for Israel, I want to share just a couple of things that are happening in that country and having to do with that country. And one of them has to do with the signing of the Iranian nuclear treaty. I think that that's probably on the hearts and minds of everyone in Israel, certainly the leadership in Israel. It's not, somebody said to me the other day, well, why is everybody so upset? It seems like such a good thing. Well, it's not a good thing. It is definitely not a good thing. And I think it's very interesting that there were deadlines, so many deadlines that were set for the signing of that agreement. And they got extended and extended and extended and extended until we were in the 3-week period leading up to Tisha B'Av. I think that's prophetic. I think that's God saying something. Critically important for us to be on our knees praying for the safety of Israel, praying that that agreement will not go through. And, I have Christians that say to me, well, you read the Bible, you know what it says. It says this is going to happen and that's going to happen. And so, why should we bother to intercede? We know what's going to happen. And I say to them, have you ever heard of a man named Moses? Remember Moses? Remember what God said to Moses? I'm going to destroy those Hebrews. God said it. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to destroy them. And then I'm going to create a whole new nation of people out of you. Now, Moses could have said, well, God said it, so I guess it's going to happen. But that's not what Moses did. Moses said, God, no, don't do that. Remember your promises. Remember your faithfulness. What will the Egyptians say? Moses said. And God changed direction. I believe we need to have that kind of heart with the God that loves us. The God is passionate for us to come into his presence boldly. Boldly. We need to be discerning the times and the seasons, aware of what's happening around us, and they'll go boldly to the throne room of God and intercede. Intercede for that little country. Intercede for their safety. Intercede for their borders. Intercede for the airspace. Intercede that every rocket fired at them will be turned back. Intercede for them. Critically important. Bibi Netanyahu, you mentioned Bibi earlier. I happen to be the chairman of Bibi Netanyahu's International Fan Club. I think Bibi Netanyahu is God's man for the hour. And just stop and think for a minute some of the things that he has done. Here we have the prime minister of the nation of Israel. Now, nation of Israel is not usually very popular on the international scene. And yet he chooses to go to the United States of America against the wishes of the American president and stand in front of the United States Congress and tell the truth. That's pretty amazing, pretty courageous. And I know that Bibi knew that every secular government in the world was watching him, listening to what he had to say. And what did he say? He quoted the Bible. That's another hallelujah moment, folks. He quoted the Bible. These are remarkable days that we are living in. And he is a remarkable man, and he's got an incredibly tough row to hoe, domestically as well as internationally. And so I believe, again, it's critically important for us, as Pastor did this morning, to be in prayer for him. Pray for wisdom. Pray for God's direction. Pray that he will lead the country in exactly the direction that God wants it to go, regardless of what the nations might say. Because God is saying, you know what? The fulfillment of my covenant doesn't depend on the United Nations. I don't really care what they think. It's all about God's faithfulness. You know, sometimes I wonder, when the Jewish people came out of Egypt and God said, this is what I want you to do. And then in Deuteronomy 28, he says, if you do, here's 14 verses of blessings. If you don't, here's 54 verses of cursings, by the way, the last one having to do with the dispersion. But what if, when he said, this is what I want you to do, they just did it? What if they had just said, okay, and they just did it? Would have been a really short book, wouldn't it? A short book. But it would have been a book about their obedience. That's what the book would have been about. But they didn't. So that's not what the book is about. The book is about him. The book is about his faithfulness. It's about his forgiveness. It's about his passionate chesed, his love, his covenant with his people. That's what the book is about. And that covenant will be fulfilled regardless. Regardless. It's not even that the church is going to have to come rushing in and rescue poor Israel. That covenant will be fulfilled because God said so. So the question for us is, where will we fit into the picture? Will we, like so many Christians in past generations, ignore what God is doing? Or will we stand against the Jewish people and get lost in the dust of history? Or will we get on board with what God is doing? Will we realize the critical importance of the fulfillment of those prophecies? Will we take our responsibility to stand with the Jewish people, to be God's hands and feet and heart and tears to the nation of Israel? Will the church do that? I hope so. And as you're praying for Israel, one more thing that I want to encourage you to pray for. It's critically important to Israel, and that's to pray for the church. Because as I mentioned before, I go many places where the heart of the church is hardened toward Israel, where Christians either have hard hearts or just don't care, or have never, they've just never thought of, why is that important? Why is that important? Rather than the church uniting in support. That's what needs to happen. The church needs to unite in support of Israel and the Jewish people. And so I ask you, please, to recognize that prayer for the church is, in essence, prayer for Israel as well. God is establishing Israel as a light to the nations. And we know what the scriptures say about how men are going to feel about light in the end of days. They will be lovers of what? Darkness, we're told. Haters of the light. And often when we read that, we think of the light of Yeshua, we think of the church, persecution. That's true. But I also believe it applies to Israel as a light to the nations. So as God continues establishing her, it's not going to get better for her. She's not going to have more friends. She's going to have fewer friends. And as that happens, our relationship, our obedience to God to be in relationship with her becomes all the more critically important. Critically important. So I want to end on that note today, end on that note of challenge. I laud those of you that pray regularly for Israel. And I plead with the rest of you, please join, become one that regularly prays for Israel. And again, I challenge you, recognize that God created you for this moment. And go before him and ask him, Father, what is my special role in supporting Israel and the Jewish people. What do you want me to do? And I guarantee you, if you ask him with a sincere heart, he'll tell you. And he will give you the courage then to move forward and do. Remember, it's what you do. He will give you the courage to do what it is he's calling you to do. And I believe my mentor in all this Israel stuff, when I first got involved many years ago, used to say, the day will come when Jews and Christians together will stand before the Lord. And we will all look and go, oh, that's what you meant. She believed there was something to be learned on both sides. I believe that together, Jews and Christians together, we can make a tremendous difference in the world that we are living in. And I believe that as we are willing to embrace the kind of discipleship that God has for us, we create the kind of disciples that when they stand before the Lord will say, well done, good and faithful servant.